So back when I was first getting started in ministry, I was a youth pastor at a really small church, and I had somebody who came to me. He was an elderly gentleman, and he was super kind, really wanted to invest in the lives of students and kids and all of this. And he came to me one day and he was like, "Chris, let me tell you my story." And he proceeded to tell me how he had been a kids pastor at a church and then eventually became the senior pastor of a church. And when he became a senior pastor, he left the ministry. He totally got out of it. He said, "I'm done with this." And I couldn't figure out why he had left the ministry. He still clearly loved Jesus, clearly loved the church. And he looked at me and he said something that has stuck with me all of these years later. He said this. He said, "I wanted to make a difference. And I realized I couldn't make a difference as the pastor. I needed to become a deacon." Now, for me, that was really confusing. I didn't understand what that meant or why he would even say something like that. Like, why would you think that you could have more influence as a deacon as opposed to a pastor? You usually don't see the deacons getting up and preaching. They're not the ones doing all the things. But what I discovered, you see, a few years later, I became a pastor. And here's what I discovered. When it comes to churches, a lot of times the deacons hold all the power. Now, we don't like talking about power in church because really it seems like something that doesn't fit. Like we really shouldn't be talking about power in church. It shouldn't be a power grab. It shouldn't be any of those things. And hear me in this. I'm not suggesting that there should be a power struggle within the church. But oftentimes you end up with people who are broken and sinful, pastors and deacons alike, that end up coming into a church and there ends up being a struggle. One of the books I've really enjoyed is Andy Stanley's book, Deep and Wide. And one of the things he talks about is he remembers watching as his dad, Charles Stanley, ends up getting punched by a deacon. Like, my goodness, like how do churches end up in such a bad place where fights and splits and all of this happens? And this is something that we can't ignore. If you are involved in a church, if you are in church leadership in any way, you can't afford to ignore the relationship between pastors and deacons. It is one of the most important relationships in the entire church. I've seen churches that struggle to grow, struggle to survive, and chances are will die unless the relationship between the pastor and the deacons can be changed. Now, why do I bring this up? This is a huge problem, and it's a problem that needs to be addressed, and it's a problem that can be fixed. It just takes humility on both sides. Now, as a pastor, I've experienced both sides of this. I've experienced incredible deacons. I mean, we are talking faithful men and women who love Jesus, who love their church, and are committed to seeing God's kingdom expand and grow. And I mean, they are everything you could want. I've also had deacons who wanted things their way, were controlling, who thought that they knew best with absolutely everything, and viewed the pastor as something that should be controlled and that the church needed to be protected from. And when you have that kind of an attitude within the church, especially within the boardroom, because usually a boardroom at a church consists of the pastor and the deacons. And when you end up with that kind of a situation, it never goes well. It always ends up to people getting hurt. It always ends up to problems in the church, maybe a church split, or maybe the church closes. And here's the thing that I truly believe. It is totally and 100% preventable. I believe it's preventable. I don't believe that churches have to go down this road. But what has to happen is you have to have an understanding of the roles behind deacons and pastors. Now, we're going to address that in the upcoming weeks as we talk through this, because this is a subject that needs a lot. Today, I really just want to kind of present it and get us started on all of this. So, what does it look like when there is an unhealthy relationship between the pastors and the deacons? This is what it looks like. I actually had several conversations with people this week and over the last couple of weeks that are in these situations. What ends up happening is you end up with pastors who are frustrated, you end up with deacons who are scared, and you end up with a church that will not grow because of the tension. It was an interesting thing. One church I was at, we had an issue between me and one of the deacons, and it kept growing and festering. And literally, I kid you not, it was like God turned off the tap to the church. There was 6 months that it took us to resolve the problem. And in that 6 months, we didn't have a single visitor come to the church. Now, before, we had visitors every single week. But during the conflict, God stopped sending people to us. It was like God was saying, you have to fix this before you can do anything else. And the moment that was resolved, all of a sudden people started coming back. It was really interesting to see. And one of the things I had to learn and I had to realize is that when there's tension behind closed doors, it's felt in the whole church. Okay? It's really hard to keep it behind that because attitudes shift, things change. There's this little bit of tension that grows and people notice. All right? Now, why do these things happen? Why do you end up with that? Why does this happen? It's typically because of miscommunication. There's a miscommunication somewhere, and I believe this. I believe this with marriages. With any relationship that you may have. If you have miscommunication, you are more likely to be offended. You're more likely to experience a struggle, a pain point, or something because you're not dealing with the issues. You're not dealing with whatever the problem may be. And that's what we have to learn to do, is we have to learn to communicate. So my goal today is just to help you start the conversation. If you're the pastor of a church, I really encourage you, start looking at these steps and start having conversations with your board. Hey, if you're a board member at a church, I want to encourage you to start looking into this, start exploring all of this, start asking questions like, why am I feeling this way? Or why is the pastor reacting this way? Or what's going on? And begin looking for that in order to solve the problem. Because what ends up happening is you end up with churches where nothing happens, no ministry is accomplished, and everyone ends up hurt. I mean, eventually the church ends up closing is usually what ends up happening. And that's a shame. That never should happen. So here's a couple of things just to help you get started in building a good relationship between the pastor and the deacons in your church. Number one, clarify expectations. Assume nothing. Nothing. All right. So let me give you just a couple of examples. If you have typically attended churches that are over the size of 200, you have a different perspective on what a pastor should and should not do than someone who's primarily been a part of churches at around that 50 to 100 range. Okay? Your perception of the pastor is going to be totally different than someone who's coming from a different experience than you. So you need to clarify expectations. Assume nothing. And let me say this, you need to really listen, okay? If you ask a question of your pastor or if you ask a question of the deacon, you need to really listen and be willing to have an open dialogue around what is practical and what is not practical. What can you do? What can you not do? What do you expect and what should you not expect? Those are things that you need to understand. You've got to have that kind of a conversation. Very first thing, clarify expectations, okay? Don't assume anything. Don't assume anything. When we assume things, people get hurt because you end up with unmet expectations and everything goes bad. Okay? So, clarify expectations. That's number one. Clarify expectations. Number two is define the goal. What do I mean by that? What are you hoping to accomplish? Now, I'm going to say this, and this might be a little bit offensive. There's a lot of times where when a pastor is interviewing at a church, they will tell him what the goals of the church are and then back out of it later. Well, what do I mean by that? Most pastors, when they go and they interview at a church and they're, looking to come there and to lead that church, what you typically have is you have a group who says, hey, we're wanting to see young families come in. Hey, we're hoping to grow. We're hoping to reach new people. We want to see the lost saved. We want all of this. And they say that that's the goal. But then when new people start showing up and taking their seat in church or getting other leadership roles, or the kids are loud or noisy, or now there's a mess, or you've got people who have messy relationships, all of these things, they end up saying, this isn't what we wanted. And yet that's what they said the goal was. You really need to have a very honest conversation about what the goal is. All right? What is the goal of your church? Why do you exist as a church? All right? If you exist as a bunker to just keep and maintain the ones who are there, and you're not looking to expand, you're not looking to go anywhere else or do anything else, you just want to maintain the friendships and relationships you have in your church, and you don't want anyone else to come in and change anything, you want it to all stay the same, be clear about that. Don't lie to your pastor and say, well, we want the church to grow. You don't. That's not your goal. If you're not willing to make sacrifices for church growth, it will not grow. All right? Now, as pastors, we need to come in and we need to be really clear with people when they say, hey, we want the church to grow. We need to be willing and able to say, here's what that'll look like. Are you sure you're okay with it? And we need to be sensitive to the fact that sometimes we look like a rogue who's coming in and trying to change everything, and many times we end up looking like we are destroying everything that the group who has been there for a long time is trying to preserve. And they're not just trying to preserve it because they're selfish. They're trying to preserve it because it's special to them, and they've sacrificed for this. You need to be sensitive to that, but you need to clearly define the goals and what you're willing to do to accomplish those goals. And this isn't a one-way conversation. This is a two-way conversation. You both have to be willing to have that conversation. All right, so the very first one is to clarify expectations. Don't assume anything. Second one is to define the goals. Why does your church exist? And what's the point of your church? The third one takes more time. Those first two are really important, but this one I think is really crucial, and this is where we're going to spend some time over the next couple of weeks. You need to define and discover the biblical roles, your biblical roles together. All right? Most of the time, if you're a deacon or a pastor, there's a good chance that you haven't really deeply studied what it means to be a biblical pastor or a biblical deacon. Okay? And so what ends up happening is we end up coming into boardrooms with actual misconceptions about what our job is. I've had board members who they thought their job was to protect the church from the pastor. Now, when you say it out loud, that sounds ridiculous, but that was what they were doing. And it caused problems and it caused tension. But when you sit down and you begin studying, here is what the biblical role of a pastor is. Here is what the biblical role of a deacon is. And you begin operating in that space and not assuming anything. There's a couple things that are going to happen. One, you'll probably be surprised. You probably will. And let me just give you a little piece into this. The term pastor is only used one time in all of Scripture to define what we call pastor today. That's not the term that's used. Typically, the term that is used is elder or overseer. Those are typically the terms that are used to describe the role of a pastor. Meanwhile, a deacon comes from the Greek word servant. We're going to dive into all of that and look at what are the differences between an overseer and a deacon. What are the differences between an elder and a deacon? All of those things. We need to understand that, and what role does shepherding play in all of those things. Okay? If you don't understand the biblical roles that you are stepping into, there's only conflict that can come. Because here's the thing. The enemy he absolutely loves to use disagreements, miscommunication, and yes, misunderstanding to destroy a church. I believe that God gave us the church to change the world. And yet, the enemy will do anything he can to destroy it. And he will always start in the boardroom. So, as deacons, as pastors, we need to be really careful about communicating clearly our expectations. This is what I expect. This is what I would like to see. And this is where I'm willing to compromise. All of those things, we need to have those expectations. You need to clearly define the goals of your church. What is the mission that your church is on? And what does it look like to accomplish that? And then you need to take time and discover what are the biblical roles in church leadership. And you need to discover that together, not on your own, together to help clarify those expectations as well. All right, guys, I would love to hear your experience. If you've been on a board before, or maybe you are now, I would love to hear your experience. I'd love to hear your questions or even your thoughts on this. Do you think that churches are struggling because of the relationship between pastors and deacons? If you do, I'd love to know why. And if you don't, I'd love to know why. But hey guys, if you can help me out by clicking like and subscribe if you found this helpful or interesting whatsoever, I would greatly appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you guys